of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 2, A New World Order. China's Re-Emergence. After benefiting from the violent expropriations and the release of energy that marked the early 1950s, rural China had in fact been subjected in 1955 to a new upheaval. Hundreds of millions of country dwellers were reorganized into communes, whose aim was the collectivization of agriculture. Private property was swallowed in them. New goals were set centrally for production, and new agricultural methods were imposed. Some of the new methods did positive damage. Campaigns for the extermination of birds that fed on crops, for example, released population explosions of insect predators, which the birds had kept in check. Others merely stimulated inefficiency. The cadres that ran the communes became more and more concerned with window dressing to show that targets had been achieved than with food production. The outcome was disastrous. Production fell catastrophically. When in 1958 a new surge of endeavor, the Great Leap Forward, was proclaimed, and an intensification of pressure on the communes followed, matters further worsened. By 1960, large areas were experiencing famine or near famine conditions. The facts were suppressed, they were not known even to many of the ruling elite. Meanwhile, some estimates now say as many as 40 million Chinese may have died in a few years. Mao stubbornly refused to acknowledge the failure of the Great Leap Forward, with which he was closely and personally identified. The hunt for scapegoats commenced within the party. In 1961, senior officials began nonetheless to gather irrefutable evidence of what had occurred. Mao's standing suffered as his rivals slowly put the economy back on the road to modernization without letting the true facts emerge. In 1964, a striking symbol of one kind of success was the explosion of a Chinese nuclear weapon. Thus, China acquired the expensive admission card to a very exclusive club. The ultimate basis of her international influence, nonetheless, was bound to be her huge population. Even after the setbacks of the famine, it continued to rise. 590 million had been thought a reasonable estimate for 1950. 25 years later, it was 835 million. Although China's share of world population may have been higher at certain points in the past, perhaps she contained nearly 40% of mankind on the eve of the Taiping Rebellion. She was in the 1960s stronger than ever before. Her leaders talked as if they were unmoved even by the possibility of nuclear war. The Chinese would survive in greater numbers than the peoples of other countries. There were signs that the presence of such a demographic mass on the border of her most thinly populated regions alarmed the USSR. Some of those in the outside world who felt positively unfriendly to the communist regime were heartened by such information, as they had been in the early 1960s about the true state of affairs. Chiang Kai shek is said to have wished to have launched an invasion from Taiwan, but to have been restrained by the Americans. But the damage was for the most part successfully concealed by censorship and propaganda. Soon, too, Mao began again to seek to regain his ascendancy. He was obsessed with the wish to justify the Great Leap Forward and to punish those whom he saw as having thwarted it, and thus to have betrayed him. One weapon he deployed against them was the uneasiness of many communists over events in the USSR since Stalin's death. A loosening of the iron grip of dictatorship there, modest though it was, seemed to have opened the door to corruption and compromise in bureaucracy and party alike. The fear that something similar might happen if discipline were relaxed in China helped Mao to promote the Cultural Revolution, which tore asunder country and party between 1966 and 1969. Millions were killed, imprisoned, deprived of their jobs, or purged. The cult of Mao and his personal prestige were revitalized and reasserted. Senior party members, bureaucrats, and intellectuals were harried. Universities were closed, and physical labor was demanded of all citizens in order to change traditional attitudes. The young were the main instruments of persecution. The country was turned upside down by Red Guards who terrorized their seniors in every walk of life. Opportunists struggled to join them before themselves being destroyed by the young. At last, even Mao himself began to show signs that he thought things had gone too far. New party cadres were installed and a congress confirmed his leadership, but he again failed. The army in the end restored order, often at the cost, this time, of the students. Yet the Red Guards' enthusiasm had been real, and the ostentatious moral preoccupations that surface in this still, in some ways, mysterious episode remain striking. Mao's motives in launching it were no doubt mixed. Besides seeking vengeance on those who had brought about the abandonment of the Great Leap Forward, he appears really to have felt a danger that the revolution might congeal and lose the moral elan that had carried it so far. In seeking to protect it, old ideas had to go. Society, government, and economy were enmeshed and integrated with one another in China as nowhere else. The traditional prestige of intellectuals and scholars still embodied the old order, just as the examination system had done as the century began. The demotion and demonization of intellectuals was urged as a necessary consequence of making a new China. Similarly, attacks on family authority were not merely attempts by a suspicious regime to encourage informers and disloyalty, but attempts to modernize the most conservative of all Chinese institutions, the emancipation of women, and propaganda to discourage early marriage had dimensions going beyond progressive feminist ideas or population control. They were an assault on the past such as no other revolution had ever made. For in China, the past meant a role for women far inferior to anything to be found in pre revolutionary America, France, or even Russia. The attacks on party leaders, which accused them of flirtation with Confucian ideas, were much more than jibes. They could not have been paralleled in the West, where for centuries there was no past so solidly entrenched to reject. In that light, the Cultural Revolution too could be regarded as an exercise in modernization politics. Yet, rejection of the past is only half the story. More than 2000 years of a continuity stretching back to the Qin and perhaps further also shaped the Chinese Revolution. One clue is the role of authority in it. For all its cost and cruelty, that revolution was a heroic endeavor matched in scale only by such gigantic upheavals as the spread of Islam or Europe's assault on the world in early modern times. Yet it was different from those upheavals because it was, at least in intention, centrally controlled and directed. It is a paradox of Chinese Revolution that it has rested on popular fervor but is unimaginable without conscious direction from a state inheriting all the mysterious prestige of the traditional bearers of the mandate of heaven. Chinese tradition respects authority and gives it a moral endorsement that has long been hard to find in the West. No more than any other great state could China shake off its history, and as a result, communist government sometimes had a paradoxically conservative appearance. No great nation had for so long driven home to its peoples the lessons that the individual matters less than the collective whole, that authority could rightfully command the services of millions at any cost to themselves in order to carry out great works for the good of the state. That authority is unquestionable so long as it is exercised for the common good. The notion of opposition is distasteful to the Chinese because it suggests social disruption that implies the rejection of the kind of revolution involved in the adoption of Western individualism, though not of Chinese individualism or collective radicalism. The regime over which Mao presided benefited from the Chinese past as well as destroying it, because his role was easily comprehensible within its idea of authority. He was presented as a ruler sage, as much as a teacher, a politician, in a country that has always respected teachers. Western commentators were amused by the status given to his thoughts by the omnipresence of the Little Red Book, but forgot the bibliolatry of many European Protestants. Mao was spokesman of a moral doctrine which was presented as the core of society, just as Confucianism had been. There was also something traditional in Mao's artistic interests. He was admired by the people as a poet, and his poems won the respect of qualified judges. In China, power has always been sanctioned by the notion that the ruler did good things for his people and sustained accepted values. Mao's actions could be read in such a way. The Chinese periphery and beyond. The weight of the past was evident in Chinese foreign policies too, although it came to patronize revolution all over the world. China's main concern was with the Far East and, in particular, with Korea and Indochina, once tributary countries. In the latter two, Russian and Chinese policy had diverged. After the Korean War, the Chinese began to supply arms to the communist guerrilla forces in Vietnam for what was less a struggle against colonialism that had been decided already, then about what should follow it. In 1953, the French had given up both Cambodia and Laos. In 1954, they lost at a base called Dien Bien Phu, a battle decisive both for French prestige and for the French electorate's will to fight. After this, it was impossible for the French to maintain themselves in the Red River Delta. A conference at Geneva was attended by representatives from China, which thus formally re entered the arena of international diplomacy. It was agreed to partition Vietnam between a South Vietnamese government and the communists who had come to dominate the North, pending elections that might reunite the country. The elections never took place. Instead, there soon opened in Indochina what was to become the fiercest phase since 1945 of an Asian war against the West begun in 1941. The Western contenders were no longer the former colonial powers, but the Americans. The French had gone home and the British had problems enough elsewhere. On the other hand was a mixture of Indo-Chinese communists, nationalists, and reformers, supported by the Chinese and Russians who competed for influence in Indochina. American anti colonialism and the belief that the United States should support indigenous governments led it to back the South Vietnamese as it backed South Koreans and Filipinos. Unfortunately, neither in Laos nor in South Vietnam, nor in the end in Cambodia, did there emerge regimes of unquestioned legitimacy in the eyes of those they ruled. American patronage merely identified governments with the Western enemy so disliked in East Asia. American support also tended to remove the incentive to carry out reforms that would have united people behind these regimes, above all in Vietnam, where de facto partition did not produce good or stable government in the South. While Buddhists and Roman Catholics quarreled bitterly, and the peasants were more and more alienated from the regime by the failure of the land reform. An apparently corrupt ruling class seemed able to survive government after government. This benefited the communists. They sought reunification on their own terms and maintained from the north support for the communist underground movement in the south, the Viet Cong. By 1960, the Viet Cong had won control of much of the South. This was the background to a momentous decision taken by the American president, John Kennedy, in 1962 to send not only financial and material help but also 4,000 American advisors to help the South Vietnam government put its military house in order. It was the first step towards what Truman had been determined to avoid: the involvement of the United States in a major war on the mainland of Asia, and in the end led to the loss of more than 50,000 American lives. Another of Washington's responses to Cold War in Asia had been to safeguard as long as possible the special position arising from the American occupation of Japan. This was virtually a monopoly, although there was token participation by British Commonwealth forces. It had been possible because of the Soviet delay in declaring war on Japan, for the speed of Japan's surrender had taken Stalin by surprise. The Americans firmly rejected later Soviet requests for a share in the occupation Soviet power had done nothing to bring about. The outcome was the last great example of Western paternalism in Asia and a new demonstration of the Japanese people's astonishing gift for learning from others only what they had wished to learn, while safeguarding their own society against unsettling change. The events of 1945 forced Japan spiritually into a 20th century it had already entered technologically. Defeat confronted its people with deep and troubling problems of national identity and purpose. The westernization of the Meiji era had seeded a dream of Asians for the Asia. This was presented as a kind of Japanese Monroe Doctrine, underpinned by the anti Western sentiment, so widespread in the Far East and cloaking the reality of Japanese imperialism. It had been blown away by defeat, and after 1945, the rolling back of colonialism left Japan with no obvious and credible Asian role. True, at that moment it seemed unlikely for a long time to have the power for one. Moreover, the war's demonstration of Japan's vulnerability had been a great shock. Like the United Kingdom, its security had rested at bottom upon control of the surface of the sea, and the loss of it had doomed the country. Then there were the other results of defeat: the loss of territory to Russia on Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and the occupation by the Americans. Finally, there was vast material and human destruction to repair. On the asset side, the Japanese in 1945 still had the unshaken central institution of the monarchy, whose prestige was undimmed and indeed had made the surrender possible. Japanese saw in the Emperor Hirohito not the ruler who had authorized the war, but the man whose decision had saved them from annihilation. The American commander in the Pacific, General MacArthur, wanted to uphold the monarchy as an instrument of a peaceful occupation and was careful not to compromise the emperor by parading his role in policy making before 1941. He took care to have a new Japanese constitution with an electorate doubled in size and now including women, adopted before Republican enthusiasts in the United States could interfere. He found it effective to argue that Japan should be helped economically in order to get it more quickly off the back of the American taxpayer. Japanese social cohesiveness and discipline were a great help, even though for a time it seemed that the Americans might undermine this by the determination with which they pressed democratic institutions upon the country. Some problems must have been eased by a major land reform in which about a third of Japanese farming land passed from landlords to cultivators' ownership. By 1951, democratic education and careful demilitarization were deemed to have done enough to make possible a peace treaty between Japan and most of its former opponents, except the Russians and nationalist Chinese. Japan regained its full sovereignty, including a right to arms for defensive purposes, but gave up virtually all its former overseas possessions. Thus, the Japanese emerged from the post war era to resume control of their own affairs. An agreement with the United States provided for the maintenance of American forces on its soil. Confined to its own islands and facing a China stronger and much better consolidated than for a century, Japan's position was not necessarily a disadvantageous one. In less than 20 years, this much reduced status was, as it turned out to be, transformed again. The Cold War had changed the implications of the American occupation even before 1951. Japan was separated from the Russians and Chinese by, respectively, 10 and 500 miles of water. Korea, the old zone of imperial rivalry, was only 150 miles away. The spread of the Cold War to Asia guaranteed Japan even better treatment from the Americans, now anxious to see it working convincingly as an example of democracy and capitalism, and also give it the protection of the United States nuclear umbrella. The Korean War made Japan important as a base and galvanized its economy. The index of industrial production quickly went back up to the level of the 1930s. The United States promoted Japanese interests abroad through diplomacy. Finally, Japan at first had no defense costs, since it was until 1951 forbidden to have any armed forces. Japan's close connection with the United States, its proximity to the communist world, and its advanced and stable economy and society all made it natural that it should eventually take its place in the security system built up by the United States in Asia and the Pacific. Its foundations were treaties with Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, which had become independent in 1946. Others followed with Pakistan and Thailand. These were the Americans' only Asian allies, other than Taiwan. Indonesia and, much more important, India remained aloof. These alliances reflected, in part, the new conditions of Pacific and Asian international relations after British withdrawal from India. For a little longer, there would still be British forces east of the Suez, but Australia and New Zealand had discovered during the Second World War that the United Kingdom could not defend them and that the United States could. The fall of Singapore in 1942 had been decisive. Although British forces had sustained the Malaysians against the Indonesians in the 1950s and 1960s, the colony of Hong Kong survived. It was clear only because it suited the Chinese that it should. On the other hand, there was no question of sorting out the complexities of the new Pacific by simply lining up states in the teams of the Cold War. The peace treaty with Japan itself caused great difficulty because United States policy saw Japan as a potential anti-communist force while others, notably in Australia and New Zealand, remembered 1941 and feared a revival of Japanese power. Thus, American policy was not created only by ideology. Nonetheless, it was long misled by what was believed to be the disaster of the communist success in China and by Chinese patronage of revolutionaries as far away as Africa and South America. There had certainly been a transformation in China's international position, and it would go further. Yet the crucial fact was China's re emergence as a power in its own right. In the end, this did not reinforce the dualist Cold War system, but made nonsense of it. Although at first only within the former Chinese sphere, it was bound to bring about a big change in relative power relationships. The first sign of this was seen in Korea, where the United Nations armies were stopped and it was felt necessary to consider bombing China. But the rise of China was also of crucial importance to the Soviet Union. After being one element of a bipolarized system, Moscow now became the corner of a potential triangle, as well as losing its unchallenged preeminence in the world revolutionary movement. And it was in relation to the Soviet Union, perhaps, that the wider significance of the Chinese Revolution most readily appeared. Overwhelmingly important though it was, the Chinese Revolution was only the outstanding instance of a rejection of Western domination that was Asia wide. Paradoxically, of course, that rejection in all Asian countries was constantly expressed in forms, language, and mythology borrowed from the West itself, whether they were those of industrial capitalism, democracy, nationalism, or Marxism. The Middle East. The survival of Israel, the coming of the Cold War, and a huge rise in the demand for oil revolutionized the politics of the Middle East after 1948. Israel focused Arab feelings more sharply than Great Britain had ever done. It made pan Arabism look plausible. On the injustice of the seizure of what were regarded as Arab lands, the plight of the Palestine refugees, and the obligations of the great powers and the United Nations to act on their behalf. The Arab masses could brood bitterly, and Arab rulers were able to agree as on nothing else. Nonetheless, after the defeat of 1948 to 49, the Arab states were not for some time disposed again to commit their own forces openly. A formal state of war presided, but a series of armistices established for Israel de facto borders with Jordan, Syria, and Egypt that lasted until 1967. There were continuing border incidents in the early 1950s, and raids were carried out upon Israel from Egyptian and Syrian territory by bands of young guerrilla soldiers recruited from the refugee camps. But immigration, hard work, and money from the United States steadily consolidated the new Israel. A siege psychology helped to stabilize Israel's politics. The prestige of the party that had brought about the very existence of the new state was scarcely troubled, while the Jews transformed their new country. Within a few years, they could show a massive progress in bringing barren land under cultivation and establishing new industries. The gap between Israel's per capita income and that of more populace among the Arab states steadily widened. Here was another irritant for the Arabs. Foreign aid to their countries produced nothing like such dramatic change. Egypt, the most populous of them, faced particularly grave problems of population growth. While the oil producing states were to benefit in the 1950s and 60s from growing revenue and a higher GDP, this often led to further strains and divisions within them. Contrast deepened both between different Arab states and within them between classes. Most of the oil producing countries were ruled by a small, wealthy, and sometimes traditional and conservative, occasionally nationalist and westernized elites, usually uninterested in the poverty stricken peasants and slum dwellers of more populous neighbors. The contrast was exploited by a new Arab political movement founded during the war, the Ba'ath Party. It attempted to synthesize Marxism and Pan Arabism, but the Syrian and Iraqi wings of the movement, it was always strongest in those two countries, had fallen out with one another almost from the start.